My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 35 years old, and the text from my father hit like a brick. You're no longer part of this family. Any further communication goes through my attorney. That was it. No explanation. No conversation. Just cold. Clinical dismissal. So I replied with a simple, okay. Then I did exactly what he never thought I'd do. I cut them off financially immediately, and completely 48 hours later. My mother called in a panic. But before we get to that part, let me back up. Because context matters. And this story didn't start with that message. It started decades earlier in Houston. My father, Raymond Carter, built one of the largest logistics companies in Texas from scratch. Started in 1985 with a single truck and a second-hand computer in a strip mall office. By the time I graduated from Rice University, Carter Logistics was a multi-million-dollar empire, serving half the state's supply chain needs. Growing up, I was the analytical one. Straight A's through high school. President of the robotics club. I studied industrial systems engineering at Rice, specializing in optimization and business processes. I was the textbook fixer, always improving, always organizing, always invisible. Then there was my younger brother, Ryan, 3 years younger. A high school baseball star who skated through life with charm and a winning smile. Ryan could charm his way out of detention and into anyone's good graces. He wasn't malicious, just entitled. And my father ate it up. Ryan has that special touch with people. Dad would say at every family gathering, "Perfect man to run this company someday." Never mind that Ryan hadn't worked a full day in his life without cutting corners. Never mind that I'd spent my teenage years practically running the warehouse inventory from my bedroom computer. That favoritism wasn't new. I remember a defining moment when I was 17. Dad told us to clean out the garage together. I mapped an entire inventory system, an entire inventory system, and labeled every toolbox, and installed shelving for maximum efficiency. Ryan showed up 2 hours late. Stacked some tools in color order because it looked better, and then disappeared. At dinner that night, Dad clapped Ryan on the back and praised him for making the garage look so professional. My contributions ignored. That was the template for the next 2 decades of my life. I left Houston after college, dove into my own career in Chicago, and stayed busy helping Fortune 500s fix their broken supply chains. I visited my parents for holidays, checked in when they needed technical help, but I never felt like I belonged. I stopped expecting anything close to fairness. Then Ryan met Brooke. She was everything I expected, blonde. Flawless Instagram aesthetic. Influencer energy. Never worked a day in her life, but somehow always carried a designer bag and new shoes. She met Ryan at a high-end cocktail bar. Within months, she was pregnant. The wedding was lavish and tone-deaf. Dad spared no expense 300 guests. Imported champagne. White horses pulling a carriage. Brooke's maid of honor gave a speech about how Brooke finally found a family who built success instead of just talking about it. I cringed through the whole evening, but I kept my distance. That was their circus. Then came 2020. I noticed the first cracks at Thanksgiving. Dad looked tired, really tired. Lines deeper than his 61 years should have allowed after dinner. He pulled me aside. "Ethan, level with me?" he said. "What do you think about Carter Logistics?" He hesitated. I'd glanced at their numbers periodically, but the picture wasn't pretty. Revenues flat. Expenses climbing. "What's Ryan telling you?" I asked. "That everything's fine. Just to slow down. He says we're positioned to ride it out." That should have set off alarm bells. The logistics industry in Texas was booming post-pandemic. If they were struggling, it wasn't the economy. It was internal. I pulled up their financials. My stomach dropped. Labor costs up 40%. Deliveries down 20%. Ryan had replaced half the delivery fleet with custom-painted, oversized trucks, doubling operational costs. Brooke, she was on the payroll as Director of Community Relations at $80 K a year. Her job: Instagram posts featuring her sipping lattes next to Carter Logistics trucks. Their warehouse was hemorrhaging inventory. Ryan had signed a 5-year lease on a storage facility 50% larger than they needed because it impressed clients. Spoiler, it didn't. Ryan had even hired 2 of his frat brothers as client experience consultants. Their job: cold call clients and ask vague questions like, "How's your shipment vibe feeling this week?" It was a mess. Against my better judgment, I stepped in. I spent 3 months rebuilding their operational systems, rewrote logistics workflows, renegotiated contracts, introduced predictive inventory algorithms. Within 4 months, Carter Logistics went from a sinking ship to record profitability. And just as the company turned around, they cut me loose. Dad called a family meeting. I thought it was to discuss formalizing my role. Instead, Brooke and Ryan had prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled "Strategic Realignment for the Next Generation." Ryan was named CEO. Brooke was promoted to Senior VP of Strategy. Me. They offered me a consulting role, unpaid. Of course, because family doesn't charge family. They allocated 70% future ownership to Ryan, 10% to Brooke, and 10% to me. When I raised the issue of the $140, I had personally invested to save their business, Dad shrugged. Family helps family. Ethan, you know that. It wasn't betrayal. It was contempt. That's when I realized they thought they won. What they didn't realize: every single system I rebuilt, the inventory management, fleet optimization, vendor contracts ran through software licensed to my LLC. And when they formally removed me from their operations, they unknowingly triggered a contractual clause that allowed me to revoke their access entirely. That was the moment the revenge began. They thought I was just some bitter older brother who'd retreat quietly, licking my wounds while they ran Carter Logistics into the ground on my back. What they didn't know, and what made this so beautiful, was that everything that made Carter Logistics profitable again, from inventory routing to supplier discounts to optimized delivery schedules to lived-in systems that I built, hosted, licensed, and legally owned. Their so-called strategic realignment was built on sand, and I held the tides in my hands. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and calmly drafted the termination letters. I wrote to every vendor whose contract I'd renegotiated, informing them that I would no longer be their point of contact and that Carter Logistics was free to renegotiate at new, likely far less favorable rates. I wrote to their three biggest clients, Morrison Construction, Titan Industrial, and Silverline Developers, letting them know I'd left the company but was launching an independent consulting practice specializing in supply chain optimization and would happily continue serving their needs. Every sentence dripped with polite finality, and by the time I hit send, I felt more clarity than I had in years. That weekend, I changed all the passwords to the logistics platform. I'd installed passwords they didn't know existed because Ryan never cared about the boring technical stuff. I revoked their access to the inventory management system, terminated the routing software's license agreement, and shut down their vendor optimization dashboards. On Monday morning, the Carter Logistics office walked into digital silence, trucks sat idle because no delivery routes were available, inventory was inaccessible, and even their payroll system migrated under my watch. I required credentials they no longer had. The punchline: they had fired the only person who could fix it. Ryan called at 9:03 a.m. sharp. His voice was already strained. "Hey. Ooh. Ethan, we're having some, technical difficulties this morning. Nothing's working. Can you hop on a call quick fix?" Maybe his casual tone cracked at the edges, but I let him dangle there. I reminded him, calmly and precisely, that they had formally ended my consulting agreement, and as such, all proprietary systems reverted to my ownership per the terms Dad signed without reading. I could hear the panic rising behind his words. In the desperation he was trying to mask with faux charm, that mask had served him well his entire life. But not today. By lunchtime, Brooke was calling me herself. She tried warmth first, that cloying, saccharine tone she used at family dinners when buttering up Dad. "Ethan, sweetie, let's not make this harder than it has to be. We're family. Surely we can work something out?" But the words rang hollow. She hadn't seen me as family when she lobbied for my demotion, or when she smiled smugly as Dad praised Ryan's leadership vision while ignoring every number I'd saved them from bankruptcy with. I told her what I told Ryan. They had 30 days to replace my systems, as stipulated in the contract. And after that, full data deletion was my legal right. She stammered something about sabotage, but I didn't care. The trap had been set long ago. They had only just realized they were in it. The real unraveling began that afternoon. Titan Industrial, their second largest client, called Ryan personally after receiving my letter and politely declined to continue doing business. Their exact words, reported gleefully back to me by an old contact there: "We prefer to work with professionals who actually understand what operational reliability means." That was just the beginning. By Thursday, 2 more major clients had jumped ship, signing contracts directly with my consulting firm instead. And all the while, Dad remained silent. No call, no email, not even a message through his attorney. He was letting Ryan handle it, or, more precisely, letting Ryan destroy everything we'd all watched him build. At home, I watched from a distance as the panic deepened. A friend of mine still on their payroll texted me updates how Ryan brought in an IT consultant who charged them $80. Zero, just to audit the systems I'd built, only to inform them that recreating what I'd done would take 6 months at best. Their warehouse operations were in chaos. One order was so poorly coordinated that 2 trucks drove across town to deliver identical loads to the wrong site, while a third site went without materials for 3 days. Every misstep bled money. And Ryan, lacking the analytical ability to understand what was wrong, defaulted to blaming everyone around him. Each day, I didn't hear from Dad, made it clearer that he was too proud or too scared to admit what had happened. Then came Brooke's meltdown. Her glamorous Instagram feed, once filled with curated shots of her posing in front of Carter Logistics trucks or sipping mimosas at charity events, became an unintentional comedy. She posted videos assuring their loyal customers that we're working through some temporary hiccups, while commenters from the construction community flooded her feed with sarcasm and screenshots of unanswered emails, missed deliveries, and empty warehouses. At first, she tried to spin it with corporate buzzwords. We're optimizing for next-level growth. We're redefining operational flexibility. But the construction world is small, and word was spreading quickly. Carter Logistics was in free fall. By the end of the second week, the panic reached Dad. He called at 10:45 p.m. on a Friday, his voice hoarse and tired. "Ethan, listen, maybe we should sit down and talk. We're willing to discuss bringing you back on more favorable terms." It took every ounce of self-restraint not to laugh into the phone. This was the man who, less than a month earlier, told me family helps family as a way to dismiss my contributions and avoid paying what I was owed. Now, my family apparently included groveling for my help. I told him, plainly and calmly, that the price for my return had gone up full repayment of my $140. Zero investment, plus an additional $100. Zero consulting retainer upfront. His stunned silence was delicious. The next morning, Ryan showed up at my front door unannounced. His normally polished look was disheveled, suit jacket rumpled. Asko. Shirt, half untucked. He looked tired in a way I'd never seen before. Like the weight of all his lies was finally crushing him. He didn't even try to fake charm this time. "I can't do this," he said, his voice cracking. I thought it would be easier. You made it look easy." He sat on my porch steps, head in hands. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him, but this wasn't a tragedy. It was accountability finally catching up. And there was no mercy left in me. I told him what he already knew, but refused to accept. "You got exactly what you asked for. Ryan, you wanted control. You got it. And now you get to live with it." And as he sat there in silence, his phone buzzed again and again with messages from furious clients, unpaid vendors, and worried employees. I realized something profound. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about closure. They had underestimated me for decades. And now, finally, they were forced to confront the reality they had ignored. I was never just the smart kid who would go make his own way. I was the one holding their world together the entire time. And now that I'd walked away, that world was collapsing. By the start of week 3, Carter Logistics had become a case study in operational failure. The once smooth flow of goods was jammed up with delays, misrouted shipments, and mounting customer complaints. Their supplier contracts had reverted to pre-negotiated rates, some even worse, because Ryan didn't understand that relationships needed constant tending, not just signature deals. The trucks, those flashy, oversized trucks he had proudly ordered, now sat idle in the warehouse lot because there was no system to tell drivers where to go. And fuel costs were eating what little revenue they could still scrape together. And through all this chaos, my phone stayed eerily quiet. Not a single follow-up call from Dad. Just a long, painful silence that told me his pride still outranked his desperation. By midweek, I started hearing rumors. A few former employees, people I had trained personally, called to say they were quitting because they weren't getting paid on time. Payroll delays were just the start. Their benefits were suspended because Carter Logistics had failed to submit contributions to the health plan administrator. Vendors began demanding cash up front or declining new orders altogether, citing serious credit concerns. The financial bleeding was accelerating, but Ryan was too panicked to stop it, too inexperienced to even triage it properly, which meant the company wasn't just sinking, it was imploding. And I watched from my downtown office window as that empire burned itself to the ground, brick by brick. At the same time, my consulting business was flourishing. The 3 clients I took from them early on referred me to others, and soon I was onboarding new accounts at a rate I hadn't even planned for. The irony was not lost on me while Carter Logistics was choking on its hubris. I was building the very business they dismissed me for, but faster, leaner, and better run. I even hired 2 of their most competent warehouse supervisors, people who were desperate for stability, and I offered them generous pay and respect they hadn't felt under Ryan's chaotic leadership. They thanked me, but I told them the truth. They were never Carter Logistics' problem. Ryan and Dad's egos were. By Friday, things turned ugly publicly. Brooke's Instagram posts became almost surreal. She was still desperately spinning their collapse as a bold restructuring effort. Posting photos of herself, sipping coffee in a pristine office, while trucks sat empty outside the warehouse behind her. The comment section was brutal. "Where's my shipment? Hope that coffee's warm because your customers are freezing." Bold move, ignoring invoices for weeks. But the most savage comment came from a former client who simply wrote, "This is what happens when you replace competence with cosmetics." That one made me laugh out loud because it captured exactly what I'd felt all these years watching Brooke insert herself into a business she didn't understand, dressing it up for Instagram likes while I handled the heavy lifting in silence. Then came the breaking point, the moment even Dad couldn't ignore. One of their biggest contracts, Morrison Development, announced publicly that they were terminating their long-standing relationship with Carter Logistics due to unacceptable service levels and repeated operational failures. This wasn't just a lost client. This was a public black eye. Morrison had worked exclusively with Dad's company for over a decade and had once been their biggest champion. Their departure signaled to the entire regional market that Carter Logistics was no longer trustworthy, and other customers began to walk away en masse. Their reputation was in freefall, and the smell of desperation wafted through every conversation Ryan tried to have with clients who were already dialing my number instead. Dad finally cracked that Sunday afternoon. He showed up at my office. I'm looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. His suit didn't fit right, too loose now. Feels like he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and his eyes had a hollow look I hadn't seen even during the financial crisis years ago. He didn't say hello. He didn't shake my hand. He just sat down across from me and sighed. Long and slow. Like it physically hurt him to speak. "We're losing everything. Ethan," he said finally, voice hoarse. "The bank's calling in the credit line. We're behind on payments everywhere. Clients won't answer our calls. Employees are quitting daily. The business you saved is gone." His words hung heavy in the air. And for a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. But pity didn't erase what he'd done. He wanted me to come back. Of course. But this time, the offer wasn't a consulting role or a token ownership percentage. "Name your price," he said quietly. Shoulders slumped. The punchline was that he couldn't afford me anymore. I told him plainly I wasn't interested in coming back to fix what he and Ryan had broken. Not unless I owned the company outright. 100%. And even then, I wasn't sure it was worth the salvage effort. His face collapsed at those words. And I watched as decades of arrogance drained out of him in that single instant. He stood slowly, shook my hand without looking me in the eye, and walked out of my office without another word. That was the moment I knew it was over. The next day, one of my sources in the banking community called me. The bank was preparing foreclosure proceedings on Carter Logistics' main warehouse and fleet assets. They were 3 months behind on payments, and their collateral had plummeted in value because their trucks were now obsolete. Their warehouse stock was mismanaged, and their client list had effectively migrated to my new company. It was, in every sense, a total collapse. I thanked my source for the information, but said nothing publicly. I didn't need to dance on their grave. The market was already doing that for me. Faster and more efficiently than I could have planned. The final blow came not from me, but from Brooke herself. She quietly filed for divorce that week, moving out of their mansion and posting cryptic captions about choosing peace over chaos and moving forward to protect my own future. The timing was impeccable. She left just before the foreclosure notices arrived. Just before the utilities at the Carter estate were disconnected for non-payment. Just before Ryan realized that she was already cozying up to a tech entrepreneur in Austin who, conveniently, had never asked inconvenient questions about her previous career as a marketing strategist, watching her pivot in real time, abandoning the sinking ship with the same polished smile she'd used to charm my father. Felt like poetic justice in motion. Ryan didn't call me again after that. Neither did Dad. The final chapter wrote itself in foreclosure filings and repossession trucks, pulling away the oversized, orange-wrapped Carter Logistics vehicles that Ryan had once proudly paraded as a symbol of his leadership. Their empty lot stood as a monument to their arrogance, hollow, abandonned, silent. Meanwhile, my business continued to grow. Clients who had never worked with Carter Logistics started signing with me. I was impressed by the way I'd built a lean, efficient, and customer-focused operation. Every new contract felt like another small confirmation that I hadn't just won, I'd built something they never could have. But it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about reclaiming control over my narrative, about proving to myself that I wasn't the invisible son anymore, the second best, the afterthought in their story of success. The irony was perfect. In trying to exclude me, they had made me indispensable not to them, but to the entire network of clients and vendors that mattered most. And as the final repo truck drove away from their shuttered headquarters, I finally exhaled, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. In the aftermath of Carter Logistics' implosion, the silence that followed was almost disorienting. After months of noise-panicked calls, disperati emails, clumsy Instagram spin, there was nothing. Ryan disappeared from the business landscape completely, no longer even attempting to salvage what little reputation he had left. Dad retreated too. Though his absence wasn't surprising, he'd built a life on control. And when that control crumbled, so did I. What was surprising was how little any of it affected me emotionally. I felt neither triumph nor grief, only a strange sense of detachment, as if I'd been watching the story of someone else's family disintegrate in real time. That realization itself was the punchline. I had never truly been part of that family. Not in the way I thought, but their absence didn't stop the consequences from cascading outward. Vendors and clients who once dealt exclusively with Carter Logistics now came knocking at my door, looking for stability and reliability. Desperate for someone who wouldn't vanish in a storm of incompetence. My business swelled faster than I anticipated. And while growth is usually cause for celebration, I couldn't shake the irony that every dollar of new business was a reminder of the empire Dad and Ryan had squandered so casually. I hired rapidly but carefully, onboarding experienced drivers, logistics coordinators, warehouse staff, many of them former Carter Logistics employees, and every time I welcomed one aboard, I couldn't help but think, this could have been theirs. But they hadn't valued any of this until it was far too late. And now all they could do was watch it thrive without them. And watch they did. My friend at the bank tipped me off that Dad had stopped in person to plead for a bridge loan, hoping to buy enough time to cobble together something resembling a comeback. But lenders don't finance denial. And Dad left that meeting empty-handed. In his reputation as a business titan, now reduced to whispers in financial circles about how badly he'd lost the plot in his final years. Meanwhile, Ryan attempted his own sort of reinvention, trying to pitch himself as a logistics consultant, offering efficiency expertise to smaller operations around Houston. I heard from a few contacts that he barely lasted a month in that game. No one hired him, not even for advice on warehousing basics. And soon, even his LinkedIn profile vanished. The punchline there was clear too: without my systems, but without my knowledge. Ryan wasn't a logistics expert. He was just a guy with expensive suits and no substance underneath. Brooke, ever the opportunist, was the fastest to land on her feet. Her social media pivot was swift and cynical, transforming her feed into wellness content within weeks of filing for divorce, inspirational quotes overlaid on images of yoga poses and ocean sunsets, posts about radical self-care and manifesting peace. She landed sponsorships quickly. There's always an audience for that brand of curated healing, and I noticed that none of her new content mentioned Carter Logistics or her brief tenure as a senior VP of strategy. In her rewritten narrative, that chapter didn't even exist. And she was just a woman overcoming vague, toxic relationships and learning to thrive after adversity. The real punchline, of course, was that her greatest success was escaping the mess she helped create before it finished swallowing her whole. While they scattered and reinvented, my business was no longer just surviving. It was thriving, in a way, even I hadn't dared hope for. I opened a second warehouse on the east side of Houston, optimized routes that cut delivery times by 35%, and built a culture that valued accountability and integrity, words that had been completely absent from Carter Logistics' playbook. My employees felt it too. Turnover was low. Morale was high. And clients praised not just the service, but the consistency. And in the quiet moments between meetings, I allowed myself to acknowledge that this wasn't just revenge anymore. It was validation. I had proven that I was never the problem. I had been the solution all along. But they'd been too blinded by favoritism and ego to see it. That was the ultimate twist. They didn't just fail me. They failed themselves. And their failure had freed me. Then, unexpectedly, Dad reached out. Not by phone, not through a lawyer, but by letter, a heavy, cream-colored envelope with his precise handwriting on the front. No return address. No greeting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it, in perfectly neat cursive, "You were right." That was all he wrote. No apology. No explanation. No offer to meet. Just those 3 words. And it felt both too little and too late. But it also felt final in a way that I hadn't expected. It was as if he was acknowledging, in his own cold and detached way, that this chapter was closed. That there was nothing left to salvage. The punchline, the bitter one, was that this was the most direct and honest communication I'd ever received from him. In the weeks that followed, Carter Logistics' old headquarters was auctioned off. I attended the auction, standing quietly at the back as buyers picked over the remnants of a business that had once seemed invincible: trucks, forklifts, shelving, office furniture. The building itself was bought by a competitor who wasted no time stripping the Carter name from the facade and replacing it with their own. It was surreal watching those letters come down, letters that had defined my childhood, that had once represented everything my father had built, now discarded like scrap metal. And as I stood there, watching those workers dismantle the nameplate, I felt lighter than I ever had before. Like I was watching a burden I didn't even know I was still carrying finally dissolve into nothing. That was the moment I knew I was free. But freedom doesn't mean forgetting. Clients who knew the whole story would ask me, sometimes hesitantly, whether I plan to rebuild Carter Logistics under my brand, to reclaim the family name now that I had effectively inherited the market. And every time, I smiled and told them no. I didn't need that name anymore. In fact, I didn't want it. The Carter name came with too much baggage, too much history, too much pain. My success didn't need their legacy attached to it. It needed to stand alone, clean and unburdened. That realization was the final emotional break. I wasn't here to continue their story. I was here to write my own. And as that reality settled in, something strange happened. The anger I'd carried all these years, the quiet resentment, the sense of injustice began to fade, replaced not by forgiveness, but by indifference. I no longer cared whether Dad regretted his choices, or whether Ryan ever rebuilt his life, or whether Brooke's Instagram audience believed her rebrand. Their opinions, their narratives, their failures no longer mattered to me at all. The punchline was that in cutting me out, they had liberated me, and I had built something better than they ever imagined possible. I didn't win because they lost. I won because I stopped needing their approval altogether. Even after all of it, the collapse of Carter Logistics, the auctioning off of their headquarters, the quiet disappearance of my family's business from the Houston logistics scene, I expected one last chapter of chaos from Ryan. He'd always been resilient in his own superficial way, a man who could fail upward on charm alone. Finding some gullible investor or client to fund his next hollow venture, but that call never came. His silence was total. And that was the punchline, without Dad shielding him. Without me quietly fixing his mistakes behind the scenes, Ryan wasn't a phoenix waiting to rise. He was ashes. Scattered and irrelevant. I heard whispers through mutual contacts that he'd moved to a small town outside Austin, working a middling job at a logistics subcontractor, handling scheduling for a 5-truck fleet. Gone were the flashy suits, the big contracts, the illusion of control. His house, that sleek modern build he'd bought on Dad's dime and once used as the backdrop for his success, had been sold to pay debts, and Brooke's departure had left him isolated. A man reduced to what he'd always been beneath the polish, entitled empty and forgotten. Every detail I learned confirmed what I already knew. His fall wasn't tragic. It was inevitable. The real tragedy was that it had taken so long for the truth to catch up with him. Dad, too, had vanished from view. But not entirely. My banker friend told me he'd moved into a modest 1-bedroom apartment in an aging building in Sugar Land. Far from the grandeur of the estate he once called home. He'd sold his classic car collection, auctioned off his antique watches, and lived quietly, driving for a ride-share service to make ends meet. Some part of me expected to feel pity for him. But instead, I felt nothing the same indifference I had started to cultivate in those weeks after everything fell apart. He had made his choices, repeatedly, over decades. And the results were just arithmetic, catching up to him. The punchline was that he was finally living the life he had implicitly assigned to me when he dismissed my value, hustling for every dollar, answering to strangers, reduced to a footnote, in an industry he once ruled, and while they faded into the background, I kept moving forward. My business expanded rapidly, but not recklessly. I took every lesson I'd learned from watching Carter Logistics fail and baked them into my company's culture: transparency, efficiency, respect for expertise, and a relentless focus on clients' real needs instead of vanity metrics. I hired smart, loyal people and paid them well. I built relationships with vendors based on trust and honesty. Clients who had never worked with my family's company came to me based on reputation alone. Referrals stacking up faster than we could onboard new accounts. The irony was perfect in dismissing me as expendable by was perfect in dismissing me as expendable by Everslice loss. My father and brother had cleared the path for me to build something far better, and it worked precisely because they were no longer part of it. But the emotional reckoning wasn't quite over. One quiet Sunday afternoon, 6 months after the Carter name was erased from the warehouse facade, I got a message from Brooke. It was brief, casual, too casual. Hey, stranger. Long time. I'm in town this weekend. Coffee. My first instinct was to ignore it. She didn't deserve a reply. But curiosity won out. I agreed. Meeting her at a small coffee shop downtown where I knew she'd be uncomfortable, no curated spaces, no carefully arranged latte art, no flattering angles for selfies. She arrived exactly as I expected, perfectly polished, carefully styled, projecting the same brand she had always worn like a mask. But the cracks were there. If you looked closely, the subtle tightness in her smile, the careful pauses when discussing her new projects. The punchline was that Brooke was still playing the same game, but with fewer pieces left on the board. She spent most of the conversation weaving a tale about turning a new page and how her wellness brand was booming, but it was clear why she was really there. She circled the topic slowly, clumsily, until she landed on it directly. Ryan. Have you talked to him? She asked. Full casual. He's not doing great. He's a good guy. Ethan. He just needs direction. It was laughable in a bitter, poetic way. Brooke, the architect of so much of the mess, now positioning herself as Ryan's advocate. I let her talk, let her spin her careful narrative about redemption and forgiveness. But I didn't offer what she was fishing for. No invitation to work together. No hint that I'd bring Ryan into my business. Not even a suggestion that I cared how he was doing. Because I didn't. And the look on her face when she realized that was the only satisfaction I needed from that meeting, after she left hurriedly. Realizing she'd gotten nothing from me, I sat alone with my coffee and reflected on how far I'd come. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at her. Not at Ryan. Not even at Dad. I wasn't obligated to carry the emotional weight of their failures or their expectations. The legacy they tried to define for me was gone. And what remained was mine alone, to build. That was the real victory, not that I had succeeded while they failed, but that I no longer measured my life in relation to theirs. The Carter name didn't matter. The Carter legacy didn't matter. What mattered was that my business, my life, my relationships, all of it was built on my own terms. Free of the dysfunction and manipulation that had defined my family for so long. And as the weeks passed, even the occasional reminders of them faded. Their old house sat empty for months before finally being purchased by a young couple starting their own family, unaware of the history buried in its walls. Ryan's name stopped appearing in professional circles entirely. Dad's rideshare profile disappeared. Likely because he'd finally retired or moved somewhere new where no one knew his name. Brooke continued to post carefully curated photos, but even her follower count dwindled, her audience drifting away to newer, shinier influencers. They were all fading into irrelevance while I was just getting started. That was the punchline I savored most, not that I had taken anything from them, but that I didn't need anything from them at all. One evening, as I closed up the office after a particularly successful quarter, I found a small package on my desk. No return address. Just my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single object, Dad's old gold pen, the one he used to sign every important contract when he was at the height of his power. No nochi. No explanation. Just the pen. Gleaming and heavy in my palm. An artifact of a dynasty that no longer existed? I sat there for a long moment, turning it over in my hands, feeling the weight of its history, but none of its sentiment. And then, quietly, I put it in my desk drawer and locked it away. Not out of respect, but as a reminder of exactly what I had overcome. Because the truth was simple. I had written my own future. And I didn't need his pen to do it. In the months that followed, that quiet delivery of Dad's old gold pen, my life settled into something new, something peaceful. The strange thing about winning is that it often leaves you with silence where noise once was. A kind of stillness that's both unsettling and liberating. My business had outgrown its scrappy beginnings and was now a respected name in the Houston logistics sector. Former clients of Carter Logistics still trickled in from time to time, telling their own versions of the story, none of which surprised me anymore. They always ended the same way. "We should have worked with you from the beginning." That sentence had become both a compliment and a reminder of how deep the denial ran in the people who had once controlled my life. But what surprised me most was how few ghosts remained. I used to imagine that every time I passed Carter Logistics' old warehouse, I would feel something sharp: bitterness, regret, triumph. But I didn't. I felt nothing. The new owners had transformed the building, painted over every trace of its past. Updated. The fleet parked out front. Even the landscaping had changed. It was as though the business that had consumed my childhood and defined my adulthood had simply evaporated, and the punchline was that the world didn't care. The Carter name didn't matter anymore, not to the market, not to the community, not even to the property that once bore it. And that realization finally set me free in a way revenge never could. Still, I found myself wondering about Dad sometimes, not obsessively, but curiously where he had gone, how he was living, to what he thought about in the quiet hours. My banker friend told me he'd disappeared from Houston altogether. Rumors swirling that he was somewhere in Arizona, living modestly, keeping his head down. No one had seen Ryan since he left Austin either. And Brooke's Instagram, always so perfectly curated, had grown eerily quiet, her follower count slowly bleeding away, as if even the algorithm had grown tired of her carefully manufactured reinventions. They had all vanished into irrelevance, while I remained exactly where I had always been, quietly competent, finally visible, finally valued, but on my own terms. Then, one rainy Thursday evening, as I sat reviewing a quarterly report at my office desk, my assistant knocked gently and said, "There's someone here to see you. Says he doesn't have an appointment, but he's your brother." I felt no rush of emotion at those words, just a calm curiosity as I stood to greet him. Ryan looked smaller than I remembered. Older, too. As if the years had finally caught up with him all at once. He wore jeans and a plain shirt. No designer labels. No watch worth more than a mortgage payment. And when he spoke, his voice had lost all pretense. "I don't want anything," he said immediately, as if anticipating my suspicion. "I just wanted to say sorry. For everything. It wasn't the apology itself that struck me. I'd long since stopped needing or expecting that, but the look in his eyes, the arrogance, was gone. The charm, the bluster, the easy confidence that had let him glide through life without consequence gone too. All that remained was an exhausted man who had lost everything, finally acknowledging that truth. And as much as I wanted to believe those words mattered, they didn't. The punchline was that forgiveness didn't require their apology anymore. It required me letting go of the need for one altogether. I told him simply, "I hope you find peace, Ryan, but I don't think we have anything left to talk about." He nodded. Not arguing, not begging, just nodding. As if he already knew that would be my answer. And then he left, quietly, without fanfare, closing the door behind him on decades of dysfunction. I never saw him again. That was the closure I hadn't even realized. I still needed not some grand confrontation or dramatic reconciliation. Just a quiet acknowledgement that we were done, that we had always been done. Really. Since the moment he chose ego over family, after that, life became simpler. And in that simplicity, I found real joy for the first time in years. I moved my office into a new building, one without any history tied to my family name. I invested in my employees not just financially, but personally, mentoring the talented ones, promoting from within, creating a company culture that valued honesty, accountability, and respect. My clients noticed too. The feedback I heard most often wasn't about our delivery speed or our pricing. It was about how easy we were to work with, how much they trusted us, how much they appreciated that we always did what we said we'd do. That was my legacy now, not the Carter legacy. Not the Carter name, just Kiet. Reliable excellence. And then came the unexpected twist, and the one that cemented everything. Morrison Development. One of the clients who had followed me early on offered a long-term strategic partnership, not just as a vendor, but as a stakeholder. They wanted to invest directly in my company, backing an expansion that would take us statewide, maybe even national. The offer was generous, respectful, and most importantly, built entirely on merit, not on family ties, not on reputation inherited from someone else, but on what I had built with my own two hands. I accepted. Of course. Not because I needed their validation, but because the offer itself proved I didn't. That night, alone in my new office, I poured a glass of bourbon and unlocked my desk drawer, retrieving the old gold pen Dad had sent me months before. I held it for a long time, feeling its weight, its history, but none of its power. Then, calmly and without hesitation, I placed it back in the drawer and locked it again, knowing I would never use it. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The pen that had once signed every important contract in our family's empire would remain unused, while I signed my future with my own. And that's when I finally understood the truth I'd been circling around all along. This wasn't a revenge story. Not really. Revenge had been the fuel that kept me moving when they tried to bury me. But it wasn't the point. The point was freedom. Freedom from their expectations, their manipulations, their legacy. The punchline wasn't that I had beaten them. The punchline was that I had outgrown them. Entirely. So I turned off the lights, locked the door behind me, and stepped out into the cool night air. My phone buzzed with a text from one of my senior managers, just a routine update about a delivery successfully completed ahead of schedule. No drama. No chaos. Just quiet. Efficient progress. And as I walked to my car, I smiled to myself not because I had destroyed them, but because I no longer needed to think about them at all.